fifth graders. Welcome back to another excerpt from Nowhere Boy by Katherine Marsh. I was just thinking in the background, you can see my chart from Number the Stars. I'll have to take that down. So when we left off, Ahmed had found refuge in Max's house in his basement, and Max... we found out that his mother has hired a housekeeper to watch over him. I'm not loving her, Madame Pauline. She's tough. She's got some biases against people, which make me nervous. And then the policeman came by, and he feels a connection to the house, Inspector Fontaine, and he wanted to make sure that it was only the residents that were living in the house. And he's going to keep a special eye on the neighborhood in this particular house because it was his grandfather's. That also makes me nervous. And we got a glimpse into how they feel, some people feel about the refugees seeking sanctuary in Brussels. And it wasn't welcoming. So let's pick up. We'll pick up with Ahmed. Chapter 7. Ahmed really hadn't planned on staying in the cellar more than a day or two, but the morning after he arrived, he woke up feverish, his throat so sore he could barely swallow. Oh no. For 3 days, he shivered and sweated and slept, curled up on the blanket. The voices of the family drifted down in a dreamlike murmur from some place above him. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, but then he realized that they really were speaking English, but he couldn't tell their accent. Were they Canadian, British, American? And their voices were too muffled and their speech too fast for him to make out what they were saying. Still, it was comforting to hear the family going about the day. The mother's shouts and the rush of footsteps, doors opening and closing, the clatter of dishes. Could be any one of our houses, right, fifth graders? There is a comfort to the normalcy of that. If Ahmed closed his eyes tight enough, he could almost imagine that he was back home in Aleppo. Aleppo, fifth graders, is a city in Syria that has been very, very severely hit by the civil war. I actually have some historical fiction books in our library on it. Escape from Aleppo is called one of them. Only late at night, when the house was still, did he dare sneak out to the bathroom to refill the plastic cup he'd found there with water, or to empty the bucket he used to relieve himself into the toilet. One night, in a feverish daze, he peeked behind the tall red shades hanging in what he had come to think of as the furniture room. He could tell from the play of light that they concealed recessed windows, and he wanted to look out at the street. When he pulled them aside, he was surprised to find a row of potted orchids on the sill, with withered green leaves and shriveled silvery gray roots. Ahmed poked his finger into the bark potting. It was bone dry. His eyes welled with pity, but he was too sick to help them. So the plants, the orchids that are sitting on the sill, need water. And he's feeling bad for the plants. What does that tell you about him? He's been there. He knows what that's like. On his fourth day in the wine cellar, Ahmed's chills and fever finally subsided, and he realized he was ravenous. He waited until the middle of the night, then crept upstairs into a cold tile hallway and through a stained glass door. Oh no, he's going upstairs. He found himself in an enormous living room with ceilings higher than any house he'd ever seen before. It felt like a palace. The fluffy white cat, who was cleaning himself on a marble windowsill, stopped to give Ahmed an insolent look, but the house was silent, the family seemingly asleep. In the dim light, he could see framed photos on a mantelpiece. He tiptoed over, curious to see who lived in the house. Most of the photos were of a teenage girl with long blonde hair and the confident, direct gaze of an adult, and a younger boy with unruly brown hair. Ahmed laughed at the boy's unnatural smile, the smile of someone who clearly hated having his picture taken. It reminded him of how every year during Eid al-Fitr, Baba would pose him and his sisters on the couch in their holiday best, always in the same order, and take picture after picture. I bet we can all relate to that, right? Fifth graders, whether you celebrate Ramadan or Christmas or Hanukkah. Parents are always taking pictures. Ahmed's eyes would smart from the flash, and in between shots, he would jump up or make faces, annoying his father, but making Nori and Jasmine laugh. How hard it had been to sit still and stare into the camera when the whole city smelled of the anise sweet bread that marked the end of the Ramadan fast. So I'm guessing Nori and Jasmine were his sisters and fifth graders. One of the questions that you can respond to today in the shared doc is, how did looking at these pictures of Max's family remind him of his own? And can you connect to that as well? But there are 2 questions for today, and you can choose which one. So that's one of them. The memory made his stomach growl, but he paused for a moment longer in front of the largest photo. Taken against the backdrop of a beach at sunset, it featured the whole family. The mother, who looked like an older version of the girl, and the father, husky and beaming, his arm around the boy. These people looked nothing like his family. They were sunburnt Europeans wearing Western clothing. And yet the protective way the father embraced the boy made Ahmed miss his own father so much he had to turn away. He stepped softly through the dining room and into the kitchen. He could hear his own breath, raspy and fast, and it seemed to him that the family could probably hear it too. He spotted a bunch of bananas hanging from a hook. It was a sin to steal, but he didn't have the strength to figure out his next move. Not without food. He couldn't think clearly anymore, and when he tried, panic and grief overwhelmed him. Baba was gone. He was alone, lost, with no money or even a phone. He had to get control of himself, and the first step was to quiet the racking hunger. But how not to be a thief? Poor Ahmed. On the counter, he spotted a square pad of notepaper and a pencil. That was it. He would keep track of everything he took and someday pay the family back. Even though he knew it was unlikely he would be able to do this anytime soon, his intention made him feel better. Fifth graders, does it make you feel better about Ahmed stealing to know that he's going to keep track and pay them back when he can? He tore off a piece of paper and picked up the pencil, then stuffed them in his pocket. Then he grabbed a few pieces of bread from the middle of a loaf and a banana and raced back down the basement stairs. Back in the cellar, he devoured the bread and the banana. They didn't fill him up, but at least he felt a little calmer, especially after he listed them in Arabic on the notepaper. He slipped out of the cellar to the orchids in the furniture room. They really were in bad shape. Someone had given them too much direct sun and too little water. But Ahmed remembered how carefully his grandfather had always checked the ailing orchids people brought to his nursery. People give up on them too soon, he'd always say. Do you think that's the same for people too? Do you think people give up on people too soon? You just need a little help, Ahmed whispered to them in Arabic. He carried them one by one to the bathroom, dunked their roots in lukewarm water in the stopped-up sink, and let them drain. Then he found a razor blade and toolkit and cut down each orchid spike so it could focus its energy on the leaves and roots. Finally, he lined them back up in front of the windows. Oh, he's taking care of them. What does that tell you about him? Wrapped up in the blanket on the cellar floor, he thought, I'll make a plan. But it seemed enough to tend to the orchids and then fall asleep, exhausted by his adventure upstairs. The next morning, Ahmed listened to the hum of the family's voices, the tinkling of bowls and spoons from the kitchen above. He knew what they looked like now, and so he could imagine them hunched over their breakfast. Finally, he heard a heavy door slam shut. He waited to be sure the house was quiet, then tiptoed upstairs. Oh! He peered out into the tiled foyer. There were no book bags or briefcases, and the coat hook was empty. The kitchen was in a state of disarray, dirty bowls piled in the sink, half-finished mugs of coffee. The family had rushed off to school and work. It appeared that all they had eaten was boxed cereal. There was no flatbread and sweet tea. Certainly not the chickpea fateh, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, Fateyh, his mother made with its flavors of garlic and cumin. Ahmed shoved the memory away. And fifth graders, that's his comfort food. So my other question to you was about your comfort food, and are there foods that remind you of home? Ahmed shoved the memory away. He drank the unfinished coffee, ate mushy spoonfuls of leftover cereal. Ugh. He took a couple more slices from the middle of a loaf of bread, then poked around in the fridge, taking a carrot, a spoonful of jam, and a pickle from a large jar. He figured these were bits of food the family wasn't likely to miss, but he still noted every bite. As he headed back to the basement stairs through the dining room, he became aware of a sound he hadn't heard in a long time: the happy shouts of children playing. It was the same sound in every language. He followed the noise to the living room and looked out the picture window. I actually like that line, fifth graders. I'm going to read that again. He became aware of a sound he hadn't heard in a long time: the happy shouts of children playing. It was the same sound in every language. Love that. So he's now looking out the living room window. On the other side of the wall, next to the yard he had run through several nights earlier, was a school. He could see a tall green fence, and on the other side of it, kids' heads and a football flying through the air. When we get to Europe, Ahmed, you'll go back to school. His father had made him this promise. He'd made it the night before they boarded that overcrowded rubber dinghy, when the boat still seemed large and the sea was calm, and the future seemed to stretch its fingers eastward to pull them to safety. By the way, fifth graders, when they say football, they mean soccer, European football. Ahmed pressed his forehead against the window. It was hard to see much more over the wall, but he didn't need to. He just listened. Maybe that's why the author wanted Max's home to be close to the school, so he could hear the voices. Something soft brushed against his leg. Ahmed started, but then realized it was just the cat. He reached down and petted its fluffy white head. The cat purred and rubbed against him. Ahmed thought about the orchids. They would eventually need more light than what they were getting through the recessed basement windows. If he left now and they remained where they were, they would die. I'm just thinking about people and what people need to survive. They need care, right? They need love. They need light, or the wither. Anyway, there was no point in running off just yet. He needed time to make a sensible plan. He needed to make sure he was completely healthy first. Perhaps he could really figure out a way to pay back the family for the food he'd taken from them. But deep down, he knew he was making excuses to linger. He didn't want to go anywhere anymore. He felt safer being nowhere. Nowhere boy. He felt safer being nowhere. Think about that. Chapter 8. Now we'll go to Max. Michael, you left the toilet seat up again. No, I didn't, Max's father shouted. Max looked up from his Cheerios. His breakfast cereal supply, 12 boxes shipped by sea with the furniture, had lasted all of 6 weeks, and now his parents' angry voices were ruining his last bowl. When we lived in Chicago, fifth graders, my husband used to have pizza shipped from our favorite place here, shipped out to Chicago on dry ice, and it was always such a special treat for us to have our pizza from home that we loved. So Max loves his cereal. You did it, said Claire, who was sitting on a stool beside him in the kitchen. She didn't even bother to look up from her phone. I don't go down there. Well, Dad says he doesn't either. Max shrugged. Look, if they weren't fighting about this, they'd be fighting about something else. He knew she couldn't argue with this. Their parents had been fighting constantly. If it wasn't the toilet seat, it was something else ridiculous. Who'd left the basement door unlocked? Who'd forgotten to get the car registered? Who bought the wrong floor wax for the cleaning woman? Who'd eaten the last banana? Who do you think left that toilet seat up in the basement? Must have been Ahmed, but you can see the family is stressed. And when the parents are stressed, what happens to the kids? Sometimes the siblings start fighting too, or sometimes they grow closer. Without looking at him, Claire rolled her eyes. I wonder why. All right, I'm going to go back. Look, if they weren't fighting about this, they'd be fighting about something else. Without looking at him, Claire rolled her eyes. I wonder why. What's that supposed to mean? You stress them out. Well, maybe that's their fault, he shot back. They're the ones who put me in a French school. At least you get to speak English. Claire gave an exaggerated sigh, like Max was being really dense, then jumped down from the stool and jammed her bowl into the dishwasher. You could at least talk to me, he wanted to say, because I can't talk to anyone else. But instead he shouted, Claire didn't rinse her bowl. Uh-oh. Not a good move, Max, if you want to be closer to your sister. Swinging her blonde ponytail around, Claire gave him a withering stare. Max knew he was being a jerk, but he didn't care. I think we've all been there, right? Fifth graders with our siblings. Claire, his mom called from the other room. I've told you 100 times, you need to rinse here. These European appliances. Claire stomped over to the sink and gave the bowl a sloppy rinse. But the brief pleasure Max felt at getting Claire in trouble faded as she stormed out of the kitchen, leaving him alone. In fact, he felt worse, and the shameful, angry taste stayed with him as he veered around dog poop on the way to school. Didn't actually make him feel better to see his sister get in trouble. The day didn't get any better. Madame Legrand handed back his last dictée, his spelling test. He scored 13 out of 77. A score so low, it almost didn't seem possible. And who in their right mind scored a test out of 77? After lunch, he stood around in the rain, pretending he could understand the Do You Speak English gang. Their real names were Jules, Louis, and Andre, and Max hung around with them at recess, but it wasn't like they could really communicate much. A soccer ball, or a football as Max had learned the rest of the world called it, rolled to a stop in front of him. Max pretended not to notice, but then he heard Oscar shouting, Max! So he kicked it back. Even though Max kicked it in his general direction, Oscar made a point of groaning loudly, as if Max couldn't do anything right. When you're tempted to act, count to 10 and think first, Miss Krantz had advised him when they had discussed impulse control. So Max counted to 10 and thought about pushing Oscar into a big pile of Belgian dog poop. That's good advice, though. Count to 10 and think first. Hard to do in the moment sometimes, but really good advice. The only decent part of his day was when Madame Legrand assigned Farah to help him correct his dictée. She pulled her chair up to his desk and smiled sympathetically at the marked-up paper. French is difficult, she said, simply and slowly, so that Max understood. She pointed to a crossed-out mess of vowels. I make this mistake, too, and French is my first language. Oh, she's sweet, because she's helping him without humiliating him. Max felt like throwing his arms around her in gratitude. But look, you have gentle, right, and étude, even the accent, and you just started learning, she said, as if scoring 13 out of 77 was actually some sort of achievement. Well, I like her already. Max didn't really believe her, but it still felt good to hear praise. He smiled and said, merci. Later, on the way home from school, Madame Pauline announced more depressing news. She had convinced his parents to sign him up for the Scouts, or Scoots, as she insisted on calling them. Max already hated the word. Took every ounce of his self-control for him not to correct her. You'll get a uniform, she said, as if he didn't already hate having to wear a uniform to school. Great, Max muttered. You'll probably already know some of the boys. They try to arrange the groups by school. Max felt even worse. There isn't an Oscar in my group, is there? Madame Pauline shrugged. I haven't seen the list. Is he a friend? More of the opposite. He expected Madame Pauline to express concern, but she seemed entirely unfazed, as if every Belgian kid had a bully personally assigned to them. Hopefully he's in your troop then. You can't do Scoots together and not become friends. I don't know about that. You want to bet, Max thought? There was only so much Oscar could do to him at school, but in the woods, He imagined Oscar purposefully leading him down the wrong trail, pushing him into a mucky pond, tying him to a tree and leaving him in the middle of some creepy, wet Belgian forest. He just had to hope that Oscar thought Scouts was as lame as Max did and would never join. And that's the end of that chapter, fifth graders. So don't forget to share your thinking in the share doc and respond to somebody else's. And I'll see you tomorrow, sweet kids. Bye.